Judge, I withdraw my objection.
Thank you for making it easy for me.
Yes, I do. Trying to hear.
As ready to sustain it.
Oh.
We were not on the record when I said that. Of course, we also weren't on the record when he said you withdrew it, so that's a problem. You ready? All right, so we're back on the record. I have considered your objection, Mr. Gutierrez, but have you decided, for whatever reason, that you don't want to assert it?
Correct, I withdraw it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So, sir, you remain under oath, and thank you, Mr. D'Angelo.
Thank you,
Sir, could you please complete your answer relative to the time it takes an officer to determine to stop shooting?
Yes, officers are trained that it takes approximately 33 hundredths of a second. 33 hundredths of a second to depress the trigger and 0.56 seconds to stop shooting.
Okay. Now, if you go back to page 22 of your report, you were about to summarize the additional evidence that supports your belief in support of conclusion number 9. Could you please summarize those?
Yes. Officer Sistek had exited Unit 238. He was the passenger in the vehicle immediately before the suspect vehicle struck it. And while he disengaged from that vehicle, he was firing on the suspect vehicle and apparently fell down. Other officers state that they observed at least one officer to be down that might have been shot by the suspects. Now, numerous officers, including Officer Brelo, stated that they observed bullet impacts into their own vehicles and windshields, and especially Officer Brelo's windshield. And that provided them, according to their statements, what their opinion was that the suspects were actually firing upon the officers. And it's also important to note that the officers involved in the pursuit, when they got out of their vehicles, they had taken the detectives came in. I know you've got a model here. You can see it's fairly congested. The officers came from the south and from the north and also from the east and converged on the suspect vehicle in the area of the units 238, 217 and the suspect vehicle, and began firing upon the suspect vehicle. The problem was that the officers were in opposition to each other, in opposition to Officer Brelo. And so when they're directing fire upon the suspect vehicle, bullets are whizzing all around. The officers and Officer Brelo reports this. There's bullet impacts against the suspect's vehicle, Officer Brelo's vehicle, the Unit 238. Officers are actually firing and hitting the police vehicle, especially 238, and glass is flying from all of these vehicles being struck. Of course, Officer Brelo had seen the suspect vehicle come towards him, and I think I already mentioned this. If not, I'll state now that his statement in the forensic evidence shows that both he and Officer Moore, his partner, both fired upon the suspect vehicle using their ambush training, and they fired directly through the windshield of their vehicle.
And that was magazine number 1, correct?
And that's magazine number 1 for Officer Brelo.
Okay. At the top of page 24 of your report, you make reference to Officer Moore firing 19 times. Is that correct?
Yes, did you say Officer Moore?
Yes.
Yes, Officer Moore.
What's the significance of that?
Well, Officer Moore had a Glock 17, which means that there are 17 rounds in the magazine, and there's one in the firing chamber in what we call battery, getting ready to be fired. So she fired from the time that she was inside the car, and then upon exiting, fired additional rounds and emptied that magazine and reloaded.
Objection.
Overruled. So you may respond.
Thank you, Your Honor. And indications are she fired one additional round from her weapon.
And what conclusions, if any, did you draw from that?
Well,
as you've set forth in your report.
My report states that she fired 19 rounds, which is an indication that not only did she empty one magazine, but she felt threatened enough to reload and to fire another round upon the suspects in the vehicle.
Again, would you please refer to that paragraph at the top of page 24? And provide us with what, if any, significance you attached in your report to her firing those 19 rounds.
That apparently Officer Moore felt that it was objectively reasonable and she had probable cause to continue to deploy deadly force against the suspects in the suspect vehicle.
And you pointed out what in that paragraph?
I pointed out that it's important to note that because she did that, Officer Moore was neither disciplined nor criminally charged for firing on the suspect vehicle. And she has expressed that it was her reasonable belief and that she had probable cause to believe that the suspects were actually firing upon her.
So hold on, sustain.
You continue to describe the firing by Officer Brelo with his second magazine.
That's correct.
And please address that issue as you noted in your report.
Yes. Officer Brelo believes that he fired several rounds through the windshield in magazine number 1, fired several rounds. He states that he reloaded, and then with the second magazine of ammunition, he exited his car en route to Unit 238 for cover and was firing upon the suspects and suspect vehicle as he was moving. So he's moving and shooting, getting to the rear of Unit 238.
Any problem with his doing that?
No, not whatsoever.
And continue with your findings as Officer Brelo's position behind 238.
Yes. Once Officer Brelo was behind 238 and had fired his weapon multiple times, he states that he looked down, noticed that his weapon was empty, and reloaded, and with magazine number 2.
Okay. And with respect to magazine number 3, what were your findings there?
Well, Officer Brelo fired an unknown number of rounds as he mounted either from behind Unit 238, and then we know that he did mount the rear trunk area of Unit 238, and then because he wanted an elevated position. Now, he also did it because he was concerned that the suspects could engage their vehicle again and run him over or pin him. He didn't want to be pinned underneath the vehicle. He could not move to his left because he was aware that officers up on the grassy knoll were directing fire, and he didn't want to get caught in the crossfire of those officers. So he went back to his both law enforcement and military training, which told him that he needed to get to an elevated platform to direct fire down on the suspect vehicle to stop the threat, because he at that point states that he reasonably believed that they were continuing to direct fire on him and the other officers. So he got up on top of Unit 238 and shot over the light bar, and that part of the vehicle would have given him just a modicum of cover. And so we have Officer Brelo directing an unknown number of rounds from the elevated position of 238 down into the suspect vehicle, and then he moved additionally.
And he also fired a number of rounds from the hood of the Malibu?
That's correct. The evidence shows that Officer Brelo subsequently moved from his position on the rear trunk of 238 to the right front hood area of the suspect vehicle and continued to direct fire down into the suspect vehicle.
Based on your experience, is there anything about the fact that Officer Brelo got on the hood of 238 and then onto the Malibu that impacts your opinion in any way in this case? Regarding his use of force.
Well, Officer Brelo states that the bullets were still whizzing around him. He could still see the impacts of the round. He could not figure out why the suspects, in his mind, continued to be moving and shooting. And and he expressed a life threat, and he was scared of being shot and killed and other officers being shot and killed. So he continued to direct fire down into the suspect vehicle to stop the threat.
Is there any police...
Objection, Your Honor. There's no basis in fact the Brelo doesn't remember being on the hood.
Well,
Where is that coming
as
from?
I recall, this is on the trunk.
That's correct, Your Honor. He was directing fire. He expressed, first of all, just to be very clear, Officer Brelo doesn't remember going from the trunk of 238 to...
I had an objection. This gentleman's answering my objection. I would like to see, he said, he fired a number of rounds.
Right.
Hood,
I object to the speaking objection.
Now he's saying what went through Brelo's mind on the hood.
Objection.
Where does that come
Okay,
from?
well, I was listening to him being on the trunk. I concur, though, that there is no evidence, namely through the defendant's Mirandai statement to BCI, of what he was thinking or perceiving while he was on the hood of the Malibu. So, and I have to confess, I don't know exactly what you said, but if you said what he was thinking while he was on the hood, that the objection is sustained and it is stricken.
Your Honor, that's not what I meant, though. I apologize if it was taken that way.
Well, it was taken that way, so. But no need to apologize.
Transcript, Judge.
No need to apologize. It's an objection that was sustained. So the next question is.
On page 25 of your report, I want to direct your attention to your opinion number 1.23. Was there any ballistic evidence that supported Officer Brelo's belief of the deadly force threat?
Yes,
And you've already testified to that, correct?
that's correct.
And at the top of page 26, did you describe the bullets and the fragments flying and the lighting conditions?
I haven't discussed the light conditions, but I
But
can...
did you in your report?
Yes, sir, I did.
Okay. And how did you characterize the lighting conditions?
The light conditions were dark, and they were changing light conditions.
And what's the effect of that?
I'm sorry, say that.
What's the effect of changing lighting conditions?
From the strobes, the emergency lights that were on in the vehicle, we have constantly changing light conditions, and those can provide indications, incorrect indications, but they can provide indications of movement.
And the next paragraph, 1.24, you indicate there's forensic acoustic evidence supporting Officer Brelo's belief of the deadly force threat. Is that correct?
That's correct.
We've had testimony in this case from Mr. Stutchman and others. You've reviewed those reports?
I have.
And does that support the basis for your conclusions in 1.24?
They do.
Have you listened to the dash cam audio in question?
I have.
What was your opinion in paragraph 1.25?
That if officer perceived the gunshots were coming from inside the suspect vehicle, it would have provided him with, would have been both objectively reasonable and provide him with probable cause to believe that the suspects in the vehicle were still returning fire upon the officers and himself.
Were these rapidly evolving events as the gunfire was taking place?
Yes, there's evidence of that.
Do the number of rounds fired by Officer Brelo equate to excessive force per se?
They do not.
And explain.
Well, the officer has to have a reason to use deadly force. He has to have probable cause to use deadly force. And as we talked about before, officers are trained that their force consideration is in the calculus of force is in consideration of what they reasonably believe is occurring around them or to them at that time. And if they believe that there is a reasonable threat of serious bodily injury or death to themselves or another officer or third party, they can use deadly force to stop that threat.
And you continue in paragraph 1.25 to talk about whether an officer has to retreat. Do you see that on page 27? And again, could you please elaborate on that again?
Again, as I've stated before, the officer specifically trained that there is no legal requirement for an officer to cease or desist or to retreat. The officer can continue to defend himself and others. He can prosecute the engagement, try to effect an arrest, and use force for purposes of defense and capture. and in so doing, not be considered to be the aggressor in the event.
Are all officers in a deadly force incident able to observe and experience the same circumstances as another officer?
Some do, some don't. It depends on where they are and what is happening in their immediate area, what obstructions they have, what the environment is, the lighting, the topography.
In your report, you deal with that issue at the bottom of page 27. What was your opinion in that respect?
Right. What I stated in my report basically is that every officer involved in an officer-involved shooting has a different perspective of what's taking place at the time, and it could be things such as their distance, the individual officer's distance from the aggressor or the threat. Number two, some people can be in positions of greater risk, and some people can be in positions of less risk. And they can also be in a position where they can either see something or they can't see something. And also, officers that have more experience than others can see things, in a different light. Also, an officer's psychological and emotional condition and response to a perceived life threat or a set of circumstances may be different.
What's the opinion that you've expressed in item 1.29?
Well, my opinion of 1.29 is something that I see in many officer-involved shootings and other uses of force. I'm trained as a police practices expert and a forensic expert to consider circumstances, statements, facts, and evidence. I can't woulda, coulda, shoulda things. I can't do 20/20 hindsight. I have to look at things the way they are, stand in the shoes of the officer, and look at all of the discovery I have to make findings and opinions as to whether an officer believed he had probable cause or acted in an objectively reasonable manner during his calculus and application of force.
In the third paragraph of your opinion 1.29, you make reference to the opinion that Mr. Katsaris made in this case, and your rebuttal to that. And please elaborate on that to the court.
Sure. I had an opportunity to review Mr. Katsaris' report on several occasions, and I see this differently. And I see it differently because not only did I spend a lot of time looking at the discovery here, but I also have my own collective knowledge of education, training, experience being involved in things like this. And what is important is sometimes people will take a look at something and they'll try to isolate an event or circumstances instead of looking at it in its totality as a rapidly evolving event. And sometimes, and we have forensic evidence here that tells us how short the time period was that this took place, one has to gauge whether it's objectively reasonable to be able to stop what you're doing, to yell orders to someone when bullets are flying all around you, and to try to assess to see if those people are submitting or they're trying to kill you. And so, or some person could say, he should have assessed, he should have gone to cover, he should have yelled some commands, that type of thing. Another person could easily look at the same set of circumstances and say, well, you've got bullets flying all around you, you believe that you're getting shot at and other officers are getting shot at, you might be killed, somebody else might be killed, we need to stop that threat. That's what we need to do right now. And so that's my point of that. So there's a couple of different ways that you can look at this, keeping in mind the severe time compression of this thing. I think we had 139 rounds fired in, under 18 seconds. The entire event, once it got into the school grounds, took place in 45 seconds, certainly less than a minute. And is it reasonable to do all those things?
How reasonable is it to believe, in the circumstances that you've just testified to, that after a 30-minute pursuit, the occupants of that Malibu would comply with orders given by police?
Well, officers are taught to take a look at, again, the totality of circumstances, and does it increase their suspicions that the persons are going to continue desperately to avoid capture at all costs, or are the actions and the behaviors of the suspects create a perception in the officer's mind that it's going to lessen the suspicion of that. And everything that we have seen in the evidence, everything at least that I've reviewed in the evidence, shows clearly two suspects desperately evading police, officers, as we've talked about, reporting behavior that is very consistent with the officer, with the suspects in the vehicle being armed, pointing weapons, maybe even shooting a weapon at them, crashing into an unmarked unit during the pursuit, crashing into another vehicle, which is Officer Diaz's vehicle on the island up ahead, and then moving forward and crashing into Unit 238, and Officer Brelo believing, once he sees that, hearing these things, and once he sees that vehicle coming down towards him, and he hasn't approached the suspect vehicle's approaching him, and he sees that vehicle smash into Unit 238 and appear to be coming at him, while people appear in the vehicle to be pointing weapons at him and Officer Moore. That certainly does nothing to decrease the suspicions that he could be seriously injured or killed.
And with those factors that you've just enumerated, also lend a reasonable officer, while the bullets are flying, to conclude that yelling out verbal commands to the driver that Malibu would be an exercise in futility and possibly even dangerous to his safety.
Objection.
Overruled.
I think we have to consider the actual events that took place, and again, take a look at those cars there in that model, or take a look at your diagram or your photographs, and you have the suspect vehicle within feet of Officer Brelo and Moore's Unit 217. You also have Officer Brelo and Moore, and especially Officer Brelo, in a horrible tactical position, not caused by himself, by the way, where the suspect vehicle is actually coming towards his door. So the officer, Officer Brelo, I think correctly when he states that he was afraid and he wanted to make this stop, I think that's correct. I don't think, officers have to make that consideration of whether they are going to stop and assess and take cover. I don't know how he's going to do that, and then yell at someone under that time and distance compression and decide whether that's reasonable or not.
At the bottom of page 28, in your opinion 1.31, what's the opinion that you set forth in the final paragraph?
Well, I've mentioned it, a couple of times during my testimony here today, but I view Officers Brelo as mindset as being, and based on what he said, I'm not trying to read his mind, everything that he said has been very consistent for me, that it was an officer that was in a mental state of potentiated by a perceived life threat, in a constant fear of being shot, killed, run over, or having another officer shot and killed. And it was, according to Officer Brelo, these were the things that were in his mind in self-preservation that allowed him to make the decisions, the calculus of force, and make the tactical decisions that he made at the time.
And you opine at the top of page 29 that when you look at those psychological issues, what was your opinion?
That Officer Brelo, given the time compression and the distance compression, made an appropriate response in opposition to what he believed to be a clear life threat to himself, Officer Moore, and other officers. In
paragraph, in opinion 1.32, you enumerate those 5 human responses that you testified about previously, correct?
Yes.
Fight, flight, hypervigilance, submission, and what was the 5th
Posturing.
one? Posturing, okay. So we don't need to cover that. You've reviewed Mr. Katsaris' report, correct?
Yes.
And Mr. Katsaris took issue with Officer Brelo for not following training and procedures relative to leaving the ground and getting up on the trunk of zone car 238 and then onto the hood of the Malibu. What are officers taught and what is the law with respect to police training procedures and policies and the impact if an officer doesn't comply with those in exigent circumstances?
Well, in exigent circumstances, first of all, policies are administrative. And policies, even though they're down in black and white, officers are always trained that in life-threatening situations, they use their discretion. And there's no codified policies, practices, police practices, or anything that I'm aware of that says that a police officer under these types of circumstances, has to assume a position of cover, has to yell out, commands, has to do this, has to do that. The primary objective is to try to save your life, try to save someone else's life. And so there's nothing that says that you can't move to an elevated position. Officers are actually trained, depending on the tactical challenges, that they can assume an elevated position.
Objection.
Overruled.
I don't see that in his opinion at all, Judge. This is brand new that he says that officers are allowed to go in elevated positions. Show me where it says that.
Overruled.
Thank you.
Continue with your answer.
And I'm just talking about how officers are trained.
Okay.
Not everything that officers are trained in you're going to find in this report. So if an officer believes that in order to stop the threat, he has to take a risk, and he has to do something that an officer wouldn't normally do, break cover, get on an elevated platform, get on the back of a car, then as far as I'm concerned, if the officer believes that it's an imminent threat and he believes that he can stop that threat, I don't see any violations of policies or practices or codified standards.
Are violation of police procedures part of the calculus that's used in determining whether or not an officer has used excessive force?
No, not necessarily.
Are officers trained that pursuant to law, if they do violate policies and procedures, those are administrative, not criminal in nature?
That's correct. Administrative policy, you might get disciplined for something like that, but just because you violated an administrative policy doesn't mean that you've committed a criminal act.
Is there any training that you're aware of, any rule, any International Association of Chief of Police model regulation that prohibits officers from leaving the ground and getting onto a vehicle in using deadly force in the deadly force incident?
No.
Overruled.
No, and let me just add one thing. When we talked about an organization like the International Associations of Chiefs of Police, that is simply a body that does research, makes recommendations. Police agencies are not held unless they buy into something that the IACP says. They're not obligated whatsoever, nor are officers obligated to follow any policy or any model policies or recommendations of any body that's not the state accreditation body.
Finally, with respect to your opinion number 1 on page 30, you conclude with paragraph 1.37, indicate to the court what's the basis for your final opinion that you've set forth there.
Yes, Officer Brelo's belief that he and the other officers were facing an imminent and active deadly force threat from suspects, Russell and Williams, who were in the car. I found that his belief, based on everything that I reviewed, was objectively reasonable. I also believe that he had probable cause to believe that. Officer Brelo's perceptions and beliefs of the other officers, that they were being rammed and shot at by the suspects, are supported by forensic facts and evidence, even though no weapon was ever found in the car. And we've talked about that. The bullet holes, the glass fragmenting off of vehicles, impacts into the vehicles, officers feeling bullets, including Brelo feeling bullets whizzing by them. I find that it was objectively reasonable for him to believe that was a continuing life threat, and that he had probable cause to believe that there was a continuing life threat. And I've mentioned before, but I'll say it again, that Officer Brelo had both probable cause, and he believed that he had the legal authority to use force, including deadly force, for self-protection, and also the protection of other officers.
In the second last bullet point on page 30, please describe what you mean in that paragraph.
Yes, what I state here is nearly all of Officer Brelo's tactical actions during the engagement, in my belief, my opinion, was that they were objectively reasonable and in conformance with nationally recognized police practices, standards, firearm training, tactical training, I say here that, any tactical decisions that he made during this engagement could be considered to be, questionable, getting on top of the roof or moving to a different location, are not, in my opinion, part of the calculus of making the determination of whether there's probable cause to believe that there's a deadly force threat and it's against you and other officers, which allows you to use deadly force. Merely what that is that's just an officer using different tactics, yes, exposing himself to risk, but officers and first responders expose them to risk almost on a daily basis. And there's evidence that other officers expose themselves to risk during this event as well.
And would those officers have potentially violated training in doing so?
Well, violating training, yes. If training says, if at all possible, you stay behind cover, then that would be correct. Officers also are trained to save other people and to stop a deadly force threat. And you'll see officers taking risks every day and breaking cover when it would be really safe probably to go home, right? It would be really safe to get behind a car and duck down and stay there forever. But that doesn't mean that you're fulfilling your obligation to save life.
When Officer Brelo was on the trunk of 238 and then on the hood of the Malibu, was he exposed to potentially being shot when doing so?
Yes, absolutely, while standing on the, actually in both occasions, albeit maybe up on top of the hood where you have a modicum of cover, but absolutely he's exposed.
And when the 3rd District detectives left their cars in the grassy area, the grassy knoll, and ran towards the Malibu, were they risking being shot?
Absolutely. You don't see any cover there.
They were not hiding behind engine blocks there, were they?
There's nothing to hide behind.
When Officer Box was at the side of 217 and came out and fired his shotgun, was he exposing himself to being shot?
Absolutely.
Based on, there's a reasonable inference about where he was when he shot based on the shotgun shell. So that is an evidence, and you can cross-examine about the fact that his testimony is not in evidence.
Thank you. Did Officer Box expose himself to being shot when he came out from the side of 238 and fired his shotgun at the Malibu?
I would state that if it was found that Officer Box did in fact leave the cover of Unit 217, go to the front or the frontal area of 217 where there is no cover, yes, he would have exposed himself directly to fire from the suspect vehicle.
And did Officer Diaz expose himself to being run over when he confronted the driver of the Malibu when it came over the grass island?
He did.
On page 31 of your report, you have your opinion number 2. Could you please state to the court what that is?
The decedent suspects, Timothy Russell and Malissa Williams, had no lawful right to resist arrest. The manner of their continued resistance significantly exacerbated the circumstances of capture by reducing the normally reasonable options of capture and the quanta of force to only deadly force.
And you set forth your reasons in support of that, correct?
That's correct.
What is your opinion number 3 in this case?
Number 3, that the conduct of the vast majority and the vast majority of officer safety tactics used by Officer Brelo for purposes of self-defense and the defense of other officers to stop a perceived imminent deadly force by suspects Russell and Williams immediately prior to the shooting were objectively reasonable.
And in support of that, do you set forth excerpts from the CAD report on
Correct.
page 32?
Correct.
In your experience as a police officer, are you familiar with CAD reports?
Yes. CAD is an acronym. It refers to computer-aided dispatch, and basically what that is a transcript, which is time-stamped, of transmissions between officers and between dispatching officers.
And did you find significant information in the CAD report relative to a weapon and shots fired that are set forth in that CAD report?
I did.
What's the basis of your opinion in paragraph or opinion 3.2?
Again, that the Officer Brelo's statements that he believed that the suspects were armed and repeatedly firing at him, and Officer Moore and other officers, is supported by the statements of Officer Moore and numerous other officers whose statements that I reviewed, who did in fact fire their weapons numerous times at the suspects in vehicle during the course of the encounter.
I think you testified by way of background that among your areas of expertise are the human factors involved in uses of deadly force?
That's correct.
And are those opinions set forth in opinion number 3.3?
That's correct. And
Could you please describe those for the court?
Yes, sir. And by way of introduction, these are factors, psychological and physiological factors, or human factors that are trained to all basic academy recruits, all the way up through the career path, through advanced officer training, when officers get both firearms, deadly force training, and officer safety tactics training. And so we learned that when officers are in a high-stress situation, the body seeks to protect itself, and so we're infused with chemicals. And we call them survival chemicals, but it's adrenaline, epinephrine, same thing, a stimulant, dopamine, which are pain blockers, and endorphins, which are also pain blockers. What these things do to us is they change, involuntarily drop into our body, and they change the way we react and the way we perceive things. And so we experience, for instance, perceptual narrowing or tunnel vision. And tunnel vision is basically created because when the stimulants are in our body and our blood pressure goes up, not only does our blood pressure go up, but the pressure of all fluids in our body goes up. And we have pressure in the vitreous fluids of our eyes. We have a cornea, which is our focal lens, and what it does is it pushes against that and it changes our vision. So normally, in a relaxed state, we can see out to about 180 degrees. But once we are adrenalized and we experience tunnel vision, we might only be able to see 10 degrees off of center, so 5 degrees on either side of center. Obviously, this can cause us risk. The next thing we can experience is auditory occlusion, which is diminished hearing, or auditory exclusion, which is loss of hearing. We can experience vasoconstriction, which is blood leaving the body and fluids and moving towards the center of the body, which can cause us to shake or not hold things properly. So there's a lot of different things that we can experience, and we saw a lot of evidence here of that, not only from Officer Brelo in his statements, but from the other officers. For instance, specifically, Officer Brelo states that he experienced tunnel vision. And this also
Judge,
creates...
Jeff, this man is not a psychologist, and he's opining on all these psychological factors. He may think he's a psychologist and a psychiatrist, but he is not. None of his CV or anything else backs up any of the information or opinions that he's giving right now regarding all these psychological factors. Okay, he's not a psychiatrist.
Actually, he was talking about physiological factors at this point.
Well,
Your Honor.
I heard
But I saw
psychological factors too, Judge.
The PhD is in something like, what was the subject again?
criminology with emphasis in forensic psych. But, Your Honor, I'm testifying simply to how officers are trained
Judge,
and what they're...
he's talking to the
Hold
court.
on.
I mean, he should be sitting there talking to the court.
I'm sorry.
Hold on. You've made your objection.
Thank you.
If his qualifications, from what I've heard so far, I believe he is likely qualified to testify to these things. Having said that, you are welcome to cross-examine him about the weaknesses in his mostly education, but also his training and experience and his inability to comment with any authority on these subjects.
Thank you, Your Honor.
You may continue.
I believe I was talking about...
You're on item 3 point, I'm sorry, page 33, your opinion 3.3.
Yes, sir. I believe I was talking about what Officer Brelo expressed was tunnel vision. And he states in one of his statements that he did experience tunnel vision. He also states that at one point he lost track of Officer Moore, his partner. This is a very common dynamic experienced by officers in high-stress scenarios. Other officers during the course of this event experience similar things. It's a loss of situational awareness. Tunnel vision it certainly creates this problem that the officer has.
In addition to that, you indicate the second last paragraph before paragraph 3.4. What are the other factors that you have enumerated here?
Yes, I talk about the fact that this happened at nighttime, and so we have the challenges of a low-light environment, and I said that the low-light environment, and also I talked about other lighting challenges, which are actually the strobe lights of the patrol cars and headlights of everybody's car can further diminish situational awareness and create, increasing psychophysiological problems that again, all relate to situational awareness. Lack of vision, distractions, the environment, all of these things go into the calculus of what how an officer will perceive things or misperceive things.
And then the final paragraph, you state what?
I state basically that the psychological problems normally associated with high-stress officer-involved shooting incidents also include memory distortions such as plausible possibilities, disassociation, temporary paralysis, and even losses of memory. And I believe that Dr. Johnson is going to be addressing these issues.
You've also dealt with those issues, though, in your experience as a police officer, correct?
I've personally experienced these issues, and I've investigated many, many cases that are very consistent with the presentations that we saw here.
Commissioner, can we go to page 1 of his report? Dr. Martinelli, you've testified as to your background and training and experience. So specifically on the objection the state just made relative to your background and experience and qualifications to testify on this subject matter.
Well, the objection was overruled. I mean, why do we need to spend additional
Are you
time?
an adjunct professor at the Forensic Science at National University?
I used to be. They can call me back anytime. I'm just too busy to work there right now.
And what were some of the areas that you taught while you were there?
I dealt with psychological behavior analysis. I dealt with criminal psychological profiling, homicide suspects, sexual assault predators. We dealt with psychophysiology in that class.
Are Are you board certified in forensic traumatology?
I am.
What's involved in that?
Education, training, and experience in the issues of emotional and psychological responses in my specific areas under stress.
Are these human factors that come up in each and every deadly force incident involving law enforcement officers?
They are.
I mean, they are not robots, right? They're human beings, and are these phony issues that you're going across the country testifying about?
There are libraries full of peer-reviewed research. This is well known in the forensic and law enforcement and firearms community.
I think even the great W. Ken Katsaris testified to some of these factors, so if he did, you would agree about tunnel vision and the human factors that he mentioned, wouldn't you?
That's correct. I have no disagreement there. These are common things that happen to even the most trained and experienced officers and military personnel.
It doesn't advance your case to demean the other expert. You can certainly point out why the expert's opinions are worth questioning, but, you know, the sarcasm is probably a little...
I understand. I think Mr. Gutierrez went beyond the word objection and was doing the same with this witness. So I think it's the sauce for the goose gander type of thing, if you'll forgive me.
I will.
Thank you.
Or even if I don't forgive you, I will forget because I have other stuff to focus on.
All right, Your Honor. I accept that. Opinion number 4 on page 34 of your report. What did you conclude in that section of your report?
My opinion number 4 states that there is no evidence that Officer Brelo experienced or demonstrated the emotion of rage during this incident, including during his deadly force response to a life threat.
Objection, Your Honor.
Overruled.
And you list the factors in support of that conclusion, correct?
Yes, sir.
On page 35, do you refer specifically to portions of his interview with BCI?
Yes, sir.
And how would you summarize, without reading all the matters cited therein, how would you summarize what you found in his interview in support of your opinion in number 4?
You know, first of all, I'm not a board-certified psychologist. We have one here that will come and give testimony to this. I'm simply testifying to everything that I've reviewed in this case. Officer Brelo's statements are very consistent with having a strong fear, what we call a phobic scale response or a life-threatening response throughout this entire incident. Never in any of his statements did I see any evidence where he said he was angry or he was enraged and had any other emotion that he felt that he was presenting other than being terrified or being afraid, acutely afraid of losing his life or having one of his partner officers being shot, killed, or run over.
And on page 36, the second paragraph from the bottom, what was your opinion in item 4.9?
I talked about Officer Brelo far more likely than not being in a mental state of acute hypervigilance, where his cognizant processing was impaired and he was goal-oriented in stopping the threat to his life and other people.
On the following page, you speak on the subject of memory loss in opinion number 4.11. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And what was your opinion in that respect?
Objection.
Overruled.
Well, again, we're going on how officers are trained, and especially detectives are trained in the interviewing process and understanding that when they're taking statements from people that have been under intense stress, you can experience some memory loss, some dynamic referred to as plausible possibilities. And I know that Dr. Johnson is going to probably talk about this at more length. But again, the officers are trained that under stress, what happens is that the slow and deliberate and cognitive process that we normally have when we use these cognitive processes actually all the time when we're not under stress, but when we're under stress, what happens is that the thought process leaves the frontal lobes of the brain where cognitive processing takes place, and it goes to the midbrain where ingrained memories are located and repetitive memories are located. And officers experience this dynamic. They go to more of the fight or flight type of processing, where now they experience the threat. They want that threat to stop. There's an overwhelming...
Based on qualification?
Yes, Judge.
Overruled.
You may continue.
There is an overwhelming desire for self-preservation, and the officers do what they believe they need to do to stop the threat. And so when these things take place, and again, investigators are trained that there are gaps in the memory. So picture the difference between a human brain and memory with a movie, where the movie will take snapshots and will go in a continuous loop. And there will be no holes in that loop. There will be no gaps in that loop. In a human mind, there are gaps in that loop. And what happens upon occasion is, because of stress, officers will simply forget things. There'll just be a blank there. And what happens upon occasion is either that blank will remain and they will never get that blank back, they'll never get that memory back, or what happens is a dynamic referred to as plausible possibilities. And that is where the mind doesn't want to have a blank. So it fills in that blank with what they believe, based on the mind's education and experience from the past, ingrained memories. Will take that memory and bring it forward like it's a real memory.
Your Honor, we have a continued objection to the psychological and medical testimony from this officer. This gentleman, we won't have to continue objecting.
You may. I haven't heard medical testimony yet, but the reason I think it's acceptable is I heard him to say, and I'm paraphrasing, that in police academies and police training, officers are instructed on these psychological phenomena and essentially to be alert for them if they arise. So I've heard his CV, I've heard his experience. I think it's acceptable. And again, you're always welcome to cross-examine on how weak his qualifications are to testify to these sorts of things. But yes, I will note for the record that any responses of this witness on subjects concerning the human mind are objected to and overruled. But if something else comes up, another reason to object, please object.
Thank you.
Are you finished with your testimony on that subject, or is there more?
No, sir, I believe I'm finished.
And again, is this experience, in your report you indicate that as part of the stress that you've discovered involving eyewitnesses and victims and also law enforcement officers in these critical use of force incidents?
Yes. Again, it's my personal experience as an investigator. It's my experience training investigators and also attending training where other investigators are in attendance and we are lectured to by board-certified psychiatrists and psychologists and informed on these issues.
So this isn't something that you're just making up here and you dreamed it would be helpful to help out Officer Brelo. This is something that actually happens in your industry?
Yes, sir. It's readily available, peer-reviewed research. It's hard to go to an officer-involved shooting school or a sexual assault investigation school and not receive this information.
Okay. If you can turn to page 38, your opinion number 5. What was that?
Does we object to this?
Yeah, I thought Rowe or Posey or both were testifying to this.
It's fine, Your Honor.
So, sustain.
Opinion number 6, sir, is what? On the last page of your report?
That, based on everything that I've reviewed, Officer Michael Brelo acted within scope and authority during this incident.
Is this for the firearm specs?
I don't believe so, Your Honor.
Oh, okay.
And what's your basis behind that opinion?
Well, I stated that he's a fully sworn police officer employed by the Cleveland Police Department, the city of Cleveland. I'm aware that he's attended the police academy, was a successful graduate of the police academy and the department's field training program. He's a certified peace officer. He was in uniform. He was in a marked vehicle. He was engaged in discretionary law enforcement duties, working within scope and authority.
Did there come a time when I asked you to review the recent Ohio Supreme Court decision in State versus White?
Yes, sir.
And did you prepare a supplement opinion or exhibit SS?
I did.
And the date of your report is March 17th,
It is.
2015.
And before I ask any more, are you able to prove to me you sent it to the other side? Or do you agree now, Mr. Gutierrez, that they did?
Judge, it was technically given to us out of rule. We received it with a motion 14 days before trial, 21 days out. But we'll let him testify to it, Judge.
Well, first of all, I appreciate that. Second, I think you or a prosecutor earlier in the case basically mentioned we will waive the 21 days. But I appreciate you, again, your professionalism and your professional courtesy.
Thank you.
Pardon the interruption.
Thank you, Your Honor. Did you review the State versus White opinion?
I did.
And based on that, you prepared this report. You annotated it with case law citations, correct?
I did.
And you also enumerated again the discovery and the evidence previously submitted, correct?
Yes.
And what is your opinion number 7?
My opinion is that in consideration of the totality of circumstances that existed at the time of this incident, it was objectively reasonable for Officer Brelo to believe that suspects Timothy Russell and Malissa Williams were armed, shooting at him, shooting at his partner, and other officers who were attempting to capture them, and that it was also objectively reasonable for Officer Brelo to believe that the suspect posed an imminent threat of great bodily harm or death to the officers and the public, and that it was objectively reasonable for Officer Brelo to believe that he had probable cause to arrest the suspects for the crime of attempted murder of police officers.
In the recitation of the case law that you have in your reports, do you make mention of the recent decision from the United States Supreme Court in the Plumhoff case, specifically number 58 on page 3?
Yes.
And you also made reference to that decision in your initial report, correct?
I did.
And again, all of your opinions 1 through 7, are they based upon a reasonable degree of professional certainty in the area of police practices and procedures, use of force, and all the associated fields of your training that's set forth in the 3 exhibits that have been submitted to the court here?
They are.
And are they also submitted based on a reasonable degree of professional certainty?
They are.
Thank you. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. D'Angelo. Sir, you remained under oath, but we're going to go off the record at this point, so you're welcome to step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
I have to say I reserve the right to make you come back tomorrow afternoon, but what we're going to try to do is take about a 10-minute break, come back and do your cross and any redirect and get you done tonight. But let's see how it goes. I mean, I'm not setting a time limit at this point, but be aware that you might be stuck.
May I ask a question, Your Honor? Just for my logistics. Are we going to continue with me tomorrow morning
We're not, well, I can't do it tomorrow morning, that's the problem. That's why I
Okay.
want to get it done tonight. So if,
Oh, okay.
point here, two things. First, I don't know if you're going to have to come back tomorrow. We might get it done tonight. Consider, though, the possibility that we won't, in which case you will have to be here tomorrow afternoon, because I've got stuff scheduled out the wazoo in the morning.
That's right. Just using your good judgment, Your Honor. I think I booked a flight for about 5:45. Would you suggest
5:45 tomorrow?
tomorrow evening?
Oh, well, I'd still like to try to get you done, but well, actually, that gives me some comfort that if we don't get you done today, we'll certainly have, at most tomorrow afternoon, we need an hour or so, which gets you out here at 2:30 or so and to the.
That'll be fine, Your Honor. Thank you very much for the consideration.
All right. So we'll go back on the record at 5:15, and we'll see how quickly or slowly it goes and figure out that. Thank you. Thank you, reporters.